The clock in the grand hall struck 9, and Duke Nathaniel Hale sat completely alone in a room built for 100 guests. Ashworth Hall had been dressed for a celebration. White candles burned along the long table. Silver plates gleamed under the chandeliers. A cake, 3 tiers high, sat untouched in the center, waiting for a knife that no one seemed eager to lift. Outside, rain tapped against the tall windows, as if even the sky had chosen not to attend. Nathaniel looked down at his hands resting on the arms of his wheeled chair. 3 years ago, on a night much like this one, a carriage had overturned on the road from London, and his legs had stopped answering him ever since. The doctors called it paralysis of the lower body. The nobility of the county called it something else entirely. They called it the end of his usefulness. He had once been the most sought-after man at every ball in the region. Mothers had pushed their daughters toward him. Lords had competed for his friendship. Now, on his 42nd birthday, the guest list that his steward had prepared sat mostly blank, each name crossed out with a polite excuse. Lord Pemberton had a prior engagement. Lady Ashcombe was feeling unwell. The Whitmores sent their warmest regards, along with their sincere apologies for being unable to attend. Nathaniel did not need to read between the lines. He understood plainly enough. A duke who could not walk, who could not ride, who could not dance at his own gatherings, was no longer a duke worth visiting. He was a duty, at best, an inconvenience at worst. The door creaked open, and Nathaniel expected his valet, or perhaps his brother, arriving late as always to make some clever remark about the empty chairs. Instead, a thin, elderly man in dark formal clothing stepped inside, his face carefully arranged into practiced sympathy. "Your Grace," said Mr. Faulkner, the family solicitor, bowing slightly. "I did not wish to intrude on your birthday evening, but there are matters regarding the estate accounts that require your attention. Your brother has requested certain transfers be expedited before the week is out." "Transfers," Nathaniel repeated flatly. "On my birthday. He assures me it is only a matter of convenience, Your Grace. Nothing more." Nathaniel almost laughed. Julian, his younger brother, had never once used the word convenience without meaning something else entirely. Since the accident, Julian had grown remarkably comfortable walking the halls of Ashworth as though he already owned them, offering opinions on staff matters, correcting the housekeeper's decisions, and speaking to guests, on the rare occasion any arrived, as though he were the one who bore the title. "Leave the papers on my desk," Nathaniel said. "I will look at them tomorrow." "Of course, Your Grace." Mr. Faulkner hesitated at the door. "Might I say, sir, that it is a shame Moore did not come tonight. You deserved better company on such an evening." The solicitor left before Nathaniel could answer, which was perhaps for the best, because Nathaniel did not trust his own voice in that moment. He wheeled himself closer to the window, watching the rain slide down the glass in long silver lines, and allowed himself, just for a few seconds, to feel the full weight of his solitude. It was in that quiet, heavy moment that he heard the smallest sound imaginable. A soft knock, low on the door, closer to the floor than any adult hand would reach. Nathaniel turned his chair toward the sound, expecting nothing, and found a small girl standing in the doorway, no older than 6, wearing a plain gray dress with a white apron that marked her as belonging to one of the household's staff families. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid, slightly loose from what had likely been a long day of playing somewhere she was not supposed to be. In her hands, held out carefully as though it were made of glass, was a folded piece of paper. "Are you the Duke?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the size of the man in front of her, and the size of the room around them both. "I am," Nathaniel said slowly. "And who might you be?" "Lily," she said. "My mother works here. She cleans the rooms in the East Wing." Nathaniel searched his memory and recalled, faintly, a widowed maid named Margaret Ellis who had joined the household staff a year or so earlier, quiet and efficient, rarely seen outside her duties. He had not known she had a daughter living with her on the grounds. "And what brings you to my study so late in the evening, Lily?" Nathaniel asked, careful to keep his tone gentle. Children rarely wandered into a duke's private rooms without consequence waiting somewhere behind them. Lily stepped forward, undeterred by the size of the chamber or the seriousness of the man she addressed. "My mother said it was your birthday. She said nobody came." She held the folded paper up higher. "So I made you this." Nathaniel took it from her small hands, unfolding it carefully. It was a drawing, done in colored chalk, of a large house with too many windows and a stick figure sitting in a chair with wheels, surrounded by smaller figures with wide, uneven smiles. Above the house, in careful, uneven letters, she had written "Happy Birthday, Duke." Something tightened in Nathaniel's chest, an unfamiliar sensation he could not immediately name. It had been so long since anyone had given him something simply because they wanted him to feel less alone, not because they wanted a favor, a title, or a piece of the estate. "You drew this for me," he said quietly, not quite a question. "You looked sad in the window," Lily said, matter-of-factly, the way only a child could deliver an observation without any intention of unkindness. "I saw you from the garden. Dukes are not supposed to be sad on their birthday." Nathaniel found himself smiling for the first time that entire day, a smile that felt strange on his face, as though the muscles had nearly forgotten the shape of it. "No," he agreed. "I suppose they are not." Before he could say anything further, quick footsteps sounded in the hallway, and a woman appeared at the door, her face pale with worry. She was perhaps 30 years of age, dressed in the plain uniform of the household maids, her light brown hair pinned back tightly, though several strands had escaped in what looked like a hurried search through the halls. "Lily," the woman said, breathless, "I have told you never to come into His Grace's private rooms." She turned quickly to Nathaniel, dropping into a hurried curtsy. "Your Grace, I am so sorry." She slipped away from the kitchen while I was finishing my duties. "It will not happen again." "Margaret Ellis," Nathaniel said, recalling the name properly now. "There is no need to apologize. She should not be bothering you, Your Grace, especially not tonight." Margaret reached for her daughter's hand, but Lily stayed rooted where she stood, looking between her mother and the Duke with the innocent stubbornness only a child possesses. "She is not bothering me," Nathaniel said, and he meant it more than he had meant anything he'd said all evening. He held up the drawing. "In fact, this is the finest gift I have received tonight, or any night this year, if I am honest." Margaret's eyes moved to the drawing, then to the empty hall visible through the open door behind her, the long table still set for guests who never arrived, and something like understanding crossed her face. "She has a habit of speaking her mind, Your Grace," Margaret said carefully. "I hope she has not overstepped." "On the contrary," Nathaniel said, "she has done what an entire county of lords and ladies could not manage to do this evening." Margaret did not ask what he meant. She simply nodded, though Nathaniel noticed something soften in her expression, a flicker of sympathy that felt entirely different from the practiced sympathy of Mr. Faulkner or the solicitor's careful words. This was something real. "Come along, Lily," Margaret said gently. "His Grace has had a long evening." Lily allowed herself to be led toward the door, but she turned back once more before leaving, looking at Nathaniel with the same open, unguarded curiosity she had shown from the start. "Will you have a happy birthday next year?" she asked. Nathaniel considered the question far more seriously than a 6-year-old likely expected him to. "I do not know," he admitted, "but you have made this one a little less lonely, and for that, I am grateful." Lily smiled, satisfied with the answer, and disappeared into the hallway with her mother, their footsteps fading into the quiet of the great house. Nathaniel sat alone once more, but the room did not feel quite as empty as it had only minutes before. He looked down at the drawing in his lap, at the crooked house and the smiling stick figures, and for the first time since the accident, he felt something other than resignation settle over him. He wheeled himself to his desk and set the drawing carefully against the small clock that sat there, propping it up so that it faced him. Then he reached for the birthday cake that had gone untouched all evening, cut himself a small slice and ate it alone, but not quite as alone as before. Outside his window, the rain continued to fall, but somewhere down the hallway, he could still hear the faint echo of a child's footsteps, and for reasons he did not yet fully understand, that sound stayed with him long after the house had gone completely silent for the night. He did not know it yet, but that small knock at his door had set something in motion that neither his brother's ambitions nor the county's cold indifference would be able to undo. Later that night, after the candles had burned low and the servants had cleared away the untouched dishes, Nathaniel wheeled himself through the quiet corridors toward his bedchamber. The portraits of his ancestors watched him from the walls, stern men in fine coats who had never once known what it felt like to be forgotten by their own class. He paused beneath the painting of his father, a man who had built much of Ashworth's fortune through sheer will, and wondered what the old Duke would have thought of an heir who could no longer stand at his own hearth without assistance. A voice broke the silence behind him. "Still awake, brother?" Julian stood at the end of the hallway, dressed for an evening out despite the late hour, his coat still damp from the rain. He had not attended the birthday dinner at all, claiming urgent business in the village, though Nathaniel suspected the truth had more to do with avoiding an evening that promised to be as thin on company as it was heavy with awkward silence. "I was just retiring," Nathaniel said. "A shame about tonight," Julian said, though his tone carried none of the sympathy his words suggested. "Perhaps next year you might consider a smaller gathering, fewer empty chairs to stare at." Perhaps, Nathaniel said, refusing to give his brother the satisfaction of a reaction. Julian's eyes drifted toward the folded drawing still resting in Nathaniel's lap, and his expression shifted into something colder, more calculating. What is that? A gift, Nathaniel said simply, tucking it protectively against his chest. From someone who understood the meaning of the day better than most of this county. Julian said nothing further, only offered a thin smile before continuing down the hallway toward his own rooms, his footsteps unhurried, as though he already believed the house belonged to him in every way but name. Nathaniel watched him go, an old unease settling deeper in his chest. His brother had always wanted more than his share, even as boys, but since the accident, that wanting had sharpened into something Nathaniel could not yet name, though he suspected it would not remain hidden for much longer. He continued to his chamber, and once the door was closed and the house had finally gone still, he allowed himself to study the drawing once more beneath the lamplight. The crooked lines of the house, the uneven smiles, the careless confidence of a child who saw nothing shameful in a man who could not walk. It was such a small thing, and yet it sat heavier in his chest than anything his brother, his solicitor, or the absent lords of the county had offered him all year. For the first time in 3 years, Nathaniel Hale fell asleep without dreading the sound of his own silence, and somewhere down the corridor, in a small room shared by a mother and daughter, Lily slept soundly as well, entirely unaware of how deeply her small act of kindness had already begun to change the course of a lonely man's life. A week after the birthday that almost went unnoticed, Nathaniel Hale found himself waiting by his study window each afternoon, watching the garden path for a small figure in a gray dress. He told himself it was nothing more than curiosity, the passing amusement of a man with too many empty hours and too few visitors. But when the clock struck 3 and Lily appeared, skipping along the gravel path with a book or a handful of wildflowers clutched in her fist, something in his chest loosened in a way it had not done since before the accident. "You are late today," he told her once, as she climbed onto the low stool his valet had placed near his chair specifically for her visits. "Mother needed help folding linens," Lily said, entirely unbothered by his teasing. "She said I could come see you after, if you did not mind." "I never mind," Nathaniel said, and meant it completely. Their afternoons together became a quiet ritual, neither of them spoke of openly, though both looked forward to it with equal eagerness. Lily would tell him about the frogs she had found near the pond, or the strange shapes the clouds made above the stables, and Nathaniel found himself listening with a kind of attention he had not given anyone in years. She asked him questions no adult would dare ask a duke. Did his legs hurt? Did he miss dancing? Did he ever cry when no one was watching? He answered her honestly, every time, because lying to a child who looked at him so plainly seemed like the greater sin. Sometimes, he admitted once, when she asked about the crying. Not often anymore, but sometimes. "That is all right," Lily said, with the easy wisdom children often possess without realizing it. "My mother cries sometimes too, when she thinks I am asleep. She misses my father." Nathaniel had learned, through careful conversation over those weeks, that Margaret's husband had died at sea nearly 2 years earlier, leaving her to raise Lily alone, with only the modest wages of a housemaid to support them both. She had come to Ashworth Hall on the recommendation of a cousin who worked in the kitchens, and had built a quiet, careful life within its walls, one that asked for nothing beyond steady work and a roof that did not leak. Margaret herself remained more cautious around Nathaniel than her daughter ever was. She would appear at the study door each afternoon at 4:30, exactly on time, to collect Lily and offer a brief, polite apology for any inconvenience, though Nathaniel had told her many times that no apology was necessary. "You do not need to thank me every day, Mrs. Ellis," he said one afternoon, as she gathered Lily's shawl from the back of the chair. "Your daughter's company is a gift, not a burden." "You are very kind, Your Grace," Margaret said, though her eyes carried a wariness that suggested kindness from noblemen had not always served her well in the past. "But kindness from a duke can be easily misunderstood by others in this house. I would not want tongues to wag over something so simple as a child's visits." Nathaniel understood her meaning, though he did not yet grasp how quickly her fear would prove justified. The first sign of trouble came from Mrs. Whitfield, the head housekeeper, a stern woman who had managed the household staff at Ashworth for over 20 years, and took great pride in the smooth, quiet running of every corridor under her charge. She approached Nathaniel one evening in his study, her hands folded tightly in front of her apron, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone delivering unwelcome news. "Your Grace," she began, "I wish to speak with you about young Lily's visits." "Is there a problem?" Nathaniel asked, setting down the ledger he had been reviewing. Some among the staff have begun to talk, Your Grace, about the amount of time the child spends in your private rooms, and about her mother. Mrs. Whitfield hesitated, choosing her words with visible care. There is concern that Mrs. Ellis may be encouraging the friendship for reasons beyond simple affection. Nathaniel felt a flash of anger sharper than he expected. Encouraging it for what reasons exactly? Some believe she hopes for favor, Your Grace. Perhaps a permanent position of greater comfort. Perhaps something more. And who exactly believes this? Nathaniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer before Mrs. Whitfield's careful silence confirmed it. Julian's fingerprints were rarely visible on his schemes, but they were always present somewhere beneath the surface, planted in careless remarks over dinner, dropped into conversations with staff who depended on his goodwill for their continued employment. I only bring it to your attention because I believe it is my duty, Your Grace, Mrs. Whitfield said. I have no complaint about the child myself. She is well behaved, and I have seen the change in you since her visits began. I only wish to protect you both from talk that could grow unkind. Nathaniel thanked her for her honesty, though the conversation left an unpleasant weight in his chest that lingered long after she left the room. He had not considered how his growing fondness for Lily and her mother might be twisted into something ugly by those looking for a reason to undermine him, or worse, to undermine Margaret's position within the household she depended on for her livelihood. That evening, he found himself watching Margaret more closely than before, searching for any sign of the calculation Mrs. Whitfield's warning had suggested. He found none. Only a tired, careful woman who kept her eyes low in his presence and thanked him too many times for things that required no thanks at all. A woman who seemed, if anything, more nervous about her daughter's fondness for him than pleased by any advantage it might bring her. Days later, the rumors reached a new height when Nathaniel overheard two kitchen maids speaking in hushed tones near the servants' stairwell, unaware that his wheeled chair made considerably less noise on the stone floors than they expected. She has her claws in him proper now, one maid whispered, sending that girl up there every day, sweet as anything. You mark my words, she will have herself moved into the family wing before the year is out. And him unable to do a thing about it, poor soul, the other replied. Easy enough to fool a man in his condition, lonely as he is. Nathaniel wheeled himself away before they noticed him, his jaw tight with an anger he rarely allowed himself to feel so openly. It was not Margaret's supposed scheming that angered him, for he knew it to be entirely false. It was the casual cruelty with which the staff spoke of his condition, as though his paralysis had somehow made him foolish as well as immobile, incapable of recognizing honest affection when he saw it plainly in front of him. He resolved that same evening to speak with Margaret directly, to reassure her that whatever whispers reached her ears, his regard for her and her daughter remained entirely genuine and entirely his own decision, free of manipulation from either side. But when he sent word for her to come to his study, it was Mrs. Whitfield who arrived instead, her face drawn with an unease Nathaniel had not seen from her before. Your Grace, she said carefully, Mrs. Ellis asked me to convey her apologies. She does not believe it wise to continue the visits, given the talk among the staff. She fears for her position, and for Lily's reputation within this house. Nathaniel felt something cold settle over him, the same helplessness he had known in the weeks after the accident, when doctors spoke over his head about his condition, as though he were not present in the room at all. Bring her to me, he said. I wish to hear this from her own voice, not delivered second-hand. She asked specifically that I speak for her, Your Grace, Mrs. Whitfield said gently. I believe she is afraid that seeing you again will only make the decision harder for her to keep. Nathaniel sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the situation settling over him fully. Somewhere in the house, his brother was likely satisfied with the results of his quiet campaign, however deniable he had kept his own involvement. And somewhere else in the house, a woman who had done nothing wrong beyond raising a kind, curious daughter, was preparing to distance herself from the one friendship that had brought light back into a lonely man's life, all because the world around them insisted on seeing malice where none existed. Tell her I understand her caution, Nathaniel finally said, though the words tasted bitter as he spoke them. But tell her also that I do not believe the rumors, and I will not allow them to dictate who is welcome in my own home. Mrs. Whitfield nodded, though her expression suggested she doubted whether such reassurance would be enough to undo the fear that had already taken root. She left the study quietly, and Nathaniel sat alone once more, staring at the drawing still propped against his desk clock, the crooked house, and the smiling stick figures now carrying a weight of meaning far heavier than the innocent gift they had once represented. For the first time since Lily's small knock had broken through his loneliness, Nathaniel understood that keeping her friendship, and her mother's, would require more than kindness. It would require him to fight, in whatever way a man confined to a wheeled chair could still fight, against forces determined to see them both driven from the one place that had begun to feel like home. He did not yet know how far his brother was willing to go to win that fight, but he intended to find out, and he intended to make certain that Margaret and Lily did not pay the price for a battle that was never truly theirs to begin with. The following morning, Nathaniel summoned his valet, a steady young man named Edwin who had served him faithfully since long before the accident and had never once treated his condition as an inconvenience to be managed. Edwin arrived promptly, helping Nathaniel dress and preparing his chair for the day, and it was to him that Nathaniel finally voiced the suspicion he had carried since Mrs. Whitfield's visit. "Edwin," he said, "I need to know exactly what has been said among the staff regarding Mrs. Ellis and her daughter. Everything. I will not hold it against anyone who speaks honestly with me." Edwin hesitated only briefly before answering. "There have been comments, Your Grace, mostly started in the servants' hall over the past fortnight. Some believe Mrs. Ellis is angling for advantage. Others simply repeat what they have heard without much thought given to its truth." "And where did it begin?" Nathaniel pressed. "Rumors of this precision rarely start themselves." Edwin's discomfort was plain, but his loyalty to his employer won out over his reluctance to name names. "Lord Julian's valet has been rather free with certain remarks below stairs, Your Grace, suggesting that his master finds the arrangement inappropriate and that it reflects poorly on the family name for a maid's child to occupy so much of your time." Nathaniel absorbed this with a grim, quiet satisfaction, not because the news pleased him, but because it confirmed what he had already suspected. His brother was far too careful to spread such talk with his own mouth, but his servants answered to him just the same, and their words carried his intentions plainly enough for anyone willing to look closely. "Thank you, Edwin," Nathaniel said. "You need not fear repeating this to me again, should you hear more." "Of course, Your Grace." That afternoon, rather than waiting in his study for a visit he suspected would not come, Nathaniel made an unusual decision. He asked Edwin to wheel him down to the east wing of the servants' quarters, a part of the house he had not visited in the 3 years since his accident, when the effort of navigating narrow corridors and uneven floors had seemed too great a burden to bother with. The servants they passed along the way stared openly, some bowing hastily, others simply frozen in surprise at the sight of their employer venturing into a part of the house typically reserved for those who served him, rather than those he served. Nathaniel ignored their reactions, and asked only to be taken to Margaret's door. He found her in the small, tidy room she shared with Lily, mending a torn hem by the light of a single window. She rose quickly when she saw him, her expression caught somewhere between alarm and confusion at finding a duke in a wheeled chair navigating the cramped hallway outside her door. "Your Grace," she said, "you should not have come all this way. Please, let me send for tea, or—" "I do not need tea, Mrs. Ellis," Nathaniel said gently. "I need only a few minutes of honest conversation, if you will permit it." Margaret glanced toward the hallway, clearly aware of the attention his presence had already drawn, before nodding and stepping aside to let him wheel himself fully into the small room. Lily, seated on the narrow bed with a wooden toy in her hands, looked up with delight at the sight of him, though she seemed to sense, in the way children often do, that this was not an ordinary visit. "I have heard what has been said about you," Nathaniel began, once the door was closed. "About your reasons for allowing Lily to visit me. I want you to know plainly that I do not believe a word of it." Margaret's shoulders eased slightly, though the wariness in her eyes did not fully disappear. "It does not matter what you believe, Your Grace, if it costs me my position here. I have only my wages to support Lily. I cannot afford to be seen as a woman who schemes her way into a nobleman's favor, whether it is true or not." "You will not lose your position," Nathaniel said firmly. "I give you my word on that." "Your word may not carry as much weight as you believe it does, Your Grace," Margaret said quietly, and though the words were bold for a housemaid to speak to her employer, Nathaniel found he respected her honesty more than he would have respected empty gratitude. "There are others in this house whose word carries weight of a different kind, and I have learned it is safer not to stand directly between them and what they want." Nathaniel understood exactly whom she meant, though neither of them spoke his brother's name aloud. "I intend to make certain that changes," he said, "but I will need your patience, and I will need you not to remove Lily from my company simply because a few frightened voices in the servants' hall have decided to whisper cruelty instead of kindness." Lily, who had been listening with the quiet attentiveness children often reserve for conversations they are not entirely meant to hear, spoke up suddenly from the bed. "I do not want to stop visiting you," she said, looking between her mother and Nathaniel with open concern. "You get sad again if I do not come." "Lily," Margaret said softly, a warning in her tone, though it lacked any real force behind it. "It is all right," Nathaniel said, smiling gently at the girl despite the seriousness of the conversation around her. "She is not wrong. I do get sad when she does not come." Margaret studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her tired eyes, and finally, she gave a small, reluctant nod. "I will not stop her visits, Your Grace, so long as you understand the risk I am taking in allowing it to continue." "I understand it fully," Nathaniel said. "And I intend to see that the risk becomes smaller, not larger, in the days ahead." He left the small room shortly after, wheeling himself back through corridors that had gone quiet with the weight of servants pretending not to watch him pass, and by the time he reached his study once more, a new resolve had settled firmly in his chest. He would not simply hope the rumors faded on their own. He would find out exactly how far his brother's interference reached within his own household, and he would put a stop to it before it cost Margaret and Lily anything more than a few uncomfortable whispers below stairs. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, delivered not to Nathaniel's desk but to Mrs. Whitfield's office, where household matters of discipline were customarily handled without troubling the Duke himself. It accused Margaret Ellis of theft. Mrs. Whitfield brought the letter to Nathaniel personally, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it on his desk, unable to meet his eyes as he read the accusation. The letter, unsigned, claimed that a silver hairbrush belonging to the late Duchess had gone missing from a locked cabinet in the family wing, and that Mrs. Ellis had been seen near the cabinet on more than one occasion during her cleaning duties. "This is absurd," Nathaniel said, setting the letter down with barely controlled anger. "Margaret has never had reason to enter that cabinet. It has been locked since my mother's death." "I agree, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield said carefully. But the letter was accompanied by a witness statement. One of the kitchen maids claims she saw Mrs. Ellis near the family wing on the night in question, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "And who is this kitchen maid?" Mrs. Whitfield hesitated. "A girl named Charlotte. She has only worked here a few months. She came to the household through a recommendation from Lord Julian's own valet." Nathaniel felt the pieces settle into place with sickening clarity. His brother had grown tired of subtlety. Rumors whispered in hallways had failed to remove Margaret from his life, so now Julian had escalated to something far more dangerous, an accusation that could see her dismissed without pay, without reference, and quite possibly reported to the local magistrate for theft against a noble family. "Bring this Charlotte to me," Nathaniel said. "I wish to hear her account directly." "Your Grace, I am not certain that is wise. If the matter proceeds to a formal inquiry, it may be better for you to remain uninvolved in the early questioning, so that no one can later claim you influenced a witness." Nathaniel understood the wisdom in her caution, however much it frustrated him. "Then question her yourself, Mrs. Whitfield, thoroughly and carefully, and search the cabinet in question. If the hairbrush is truly missing, I want to know precisely when it disappeared, and I want to know if Margaret was anywhere near the family wing on nights other than the one in question, so we might understand whether this accusation holds any consistency at all." Mrs. Whitfield left to carry out his instructions, and Nathaniel spent the remainder of the morning in a state of restless anger he had not felt since the early days after his accident, when helplessness had consumed nearly every waking hour. He wheeled himself to the window and watched the garden path, half expecting to see Lily skipping along it as she did most afternoons, though it was still hours before her usual visit. He did not have to wait long before trouble found him. Julian arrived at his study door before noon, his expression arranged in careful concern, though Nathaniel had grown skilled enough at reading his brother's moods to recognize the satisfaction hiding just beneath the surface. "I heard troubling news this morning," Julian said, settling into the chair across from Nathaniel's desk without waiting for an invitation. "Something about theft in the family wing. I must say, brother, I did warn you that allowing servants such familiar access to the household would eventually invite trouble." "You have heard quickly," Nathaniel said flatly. "The letter arrived only this morning." "Servants talk, Nathaniel. You know this as well as I do." Julian's smile did not reach his eyes. "I only hope, for your own sake, that you do not allow personal fondness to cloud your judgment in this matter. A duke who protects a thief, even out of misplaced affection for her child, invites questions about his own fitness to manage the estate." There it was, spoken almost carelessly, as though it were simply an offhand observation, rather than a threat carefully constructed to remind Nathaniel exactly what was at stake, should he choose to defend Margaret too openly. Nathaniel kept his expression neutral, though the effort cost him more than he cared to admit. "I have full confidence in Mrs. Ellis's honesty," Nathaniel said evenly, "and I intend to see this matter investigated properly, without prejudice toward any party, including whoever brought forward this accusation." Julian's smile flickered, just barely, before settling back into place. "Of course. I only want what is best for the family name, brother, nothing more." He left shortly after, and Nathaniel sat alone with the growing certainty that his brother's ambitions had moved beyond simple whispers and into something far more calculated, a plan designed not merely to remove Margaret from the household, but to weaken Nathaniel's own standing in the process, painting him as a man whose judgment could no longer be trusted, whether due to his condition, his loneliness, or both. By afternoon, Mrs. Whitfield returned with news that only deepened the tangle. The silver hairbrush had indeed been found missing from the cabinet, though upon closer inspection, the cabinet's lock showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting whoever had taken it possessed a key, or access to one. Margaret, as a housemaid without duties in the family wing's private chambers, had never been issued such a key. "Who does possess a key to that cabinet?" Nathaniel asked. "Only a handful of people, Your Grace. Myself, your late mother's former lady's maid, who left service 2 years ago. And," Mrs. Whitfield paused, "Lord Julian, who inherited a set of keys to the family wing after your accident, when it was assumed you would need assistance managing certain household matters." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy between them. Nathaniel did not need Mrs. Whitfield to state the obvious conclusion aloud. His brother had access to the very cabinet from which the item had disappeared, and had somehow arranged for that theft to be blamed on the one servant whose removal would serve his interests most completely. "And the witness, Charlotte?" Nathaniel asked. "What did she say when questioned?" "She grew nervous under close questioning, Your Grace. Her account of the night in question changed twice, first claiming she saw Mrs. Ellis near the cabinet itself, then later claiming only that she saw her passing through the corridor at a distance. I do not believe her testimony would hold firm under any serious scrutiny." Nathaniel felt a grim satisfaction at this, though it did little to ease the danger Margaret still faced. An unproven accusation, even one built on shaky testimony, could still cost a servant her position and her reputation if the household chose to act on suspicion rather than proof. He needed something more solid, something that would clear Margaret's name beyond any reasonable doubt, before his brother found some other way to press the matter forward. That evening, rather than waiting for Lily's usual visit, Nathaniel sent word asking Margaret to come speak with him directly, understanding now that whatever caution had guided her earlier decisions no longer served either of them well in the face of an accusation this serious. She arrived pale and visibly shaken, her hands twisting together in front of her apron as she stood before his desk. "Your Grace, I swear to you, I have never touched anything in that cabinet. I did not even know it contained silver until Mrs. Whitfield mentioned it to me this morning." "I believe you, Margaret," Nathaniel said, and the use of her given name, rather than the formal address he usually maintained, seemed to steady her slightly. "I have already learned enough to know this accusation was constructed, not discovered honestly." "Constructed by whom?" Margaret asked, though her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. "I cannot yet prove it," Nathaniel said carefully, unwilling to name his brother outright without firmer evidence, even in private conversation. "But I intend to. In the meantime, I need you to tell me plainly, have you noticed anyone showing unusual interest in your movements around the household these past weeks? Anyone asking questions about your schedule, or where you might be found at certain hours?" Margaret considered this for a long moment before answering. "There was a footman, a few days past, who asked rather pointedly whether I ever had cause to pass through the family wing during my evening duties. I thought little of it at the time. Footmen gossip as freely as maids do. Do you recall his name?" "Grayson, I believe. He does not usually work in this part of the house." I had not seen him before that conversation. Nathaniel filed the name away carefully, suspecting it would connect eventually to Julian's growing web of quiet allies among the staff, servants who owed their positions or their favor to the younger brother rather than the elder, and who could be relied upon to plant seeds of suspicion wherever they were needed most. "I want you to continue your duties as normal," Nathaniel said finally. "Do not give anyone reason to believe you fear this accusation, even if privately you do. I will handle the matter from my end, and I will not allow it to cost you your position, whatever it takes to prove your innocence." Margaret's eyes glistened, though she blinked the emotion back quickly, maintaining the composure that had clearly served her well through years of hardship. "Why do you fight so hard for me, Your Grace? I am only a maid. There are a dozen women in this house who could take my place without any trouble at all." Nathaniel considered the question seriously before answering. "Because your daughter reminded me what it felt like to be seen as a person again, rather than a burden to be managed. I do not intend to let that kindness be repaid with cruelty, especially not cruelty manufactured for reasons that have nothing to do with you at all." Margaret left the study that evening with something steadier in her posture than she had carried in, though the danger surrounding her had not yet passed. Nathaniel spent the following days working quietly through Edwin and Mrs. Whitfield, gathering small pieces of information about Grayson's movements, about the footman's sudden and unusual presence in a part of the house he had no legitimate reason to frequent, about the precise timing of when the hairbrush had gone missing, compared to when Julian himself had last been seen entering the family wing. The picture that emerged was not yet complete enough to present publicly, but it was enough to convince Nathaniel beyond any doubt that his brother's fingerprints lay somewhere beneath every thread of the accusation against Margaret. What remained uncertain was how far Julian was willing to go to see the matter through to its conclusion, and whether Nathaniel, confined as he was to a wheeled chair and years out of practice at navigating the sharper politics of noble households, possessed the strength and cunning necessary to stop him before real and lasting harm was done. As the days passed, Lily's visits continued, though Nathaniel noticed a new heaviness in her mother's manner each time she came to collect her daughter, a fear that no reassurance from him seemed fully able to dispel. He understood, with growing clarity, that words alone would not be enough to protect them. He would need proof, undeniable and complete, and he would need it before his brother found some new and more damaging accusation to press forward, in place of the one that had already begun to crumble under closer scrutiny. Late one night, unable to sleep, Nathaniel wheeled himself to his study and sat alone with the household ledgers spread across his desk, searching for anything unusual, any pattern of spending or movement that might connect Julian more directly to the scheme unfolding around them. It was tedious, difficult work, made harder by his own unfamiliarity with the finer details of estate management. Matters he had left largely to solicitors and stewards in the years since his accident had made such close attention feel impossibly burdensome. But as he worked late into the night, candle burning low beside him, Nathaniel found something he had not expected. A series of small, irregular payments made from the estate's accounts over the past several months, each authorized under Julian's signature, each directed toward purposes vague enough to avoid immediate suspicion, yet consistent enough in their timing to suggest a pattern deliberately hidden beneath the surface of ordinary household expenses. It was not proof of the theft accusation against Margaret, not yet, but it was proof of something else entirely, something that suggested his brother's ambitions reached far beyond a single housemaid's dismissal, into territory that touched the very foundation of the estate itself. Nathaniel closed the ledger carefully, his mind racing with the implications of what he had found, and understood, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in his chest, that the battle ahead would require far more than clearing one woman's name. It would require uncovering exactly how much of Ashworth's future his brother had already quietly maneuvered to claim for himself, long before any birthday, any accusation, or any small child's innocent friendship had ever entered into the equation at all. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sent word before dawn asking Mr. Faulkner to attend him privately, away from the usual routine of estate business that might draw notice from anyone watching the household's comings and goings too closely. The solicitor arrived within the hour, still fastening the last button of his coat, clearly startled by the urgency of the summons. "Your Grace," Faulkner said, "is something amiss?" "I need you to examine these payments," Nathaniel said, sliding the ledger across the desk, "and tell me honestly whether you recognize any legitimate purpose behind them. I want no assumptions made in my brother's favor simply because his signature authorizes them." Faulkner studied the entries for several long minutes, his brow creasing deeper with each page he turned. "These are unusual, Your Grace. Payments to accounts I do not recognize, described only as consulting fees or estate improvements, with no corresponding invoices or receipts on file. In my years managing this estate's affairs, I have never seen expenditures recorded with so little supporting documentation." "Could they be explained innocently?" Nathaniel asked, though he already suspected the answer. "It is possible," Faulkner admitted. "But the pattern troubles me. The amounts grow steadily over the past several months, and the timing corresponds closely with periods when Lord Julian requested greater independence in managing certain household accounts, citing your own limited involvement since your accident as justification." Nathaniel absorbed this quietly, the pieces of his brother's ambition arranging themselves into a picture far larger and more troubling than a single stolen hairbrush or a servant's threatened dismissal. Julian had not simply grown impatient waiting for a title that might never come to him directly. He had begun quietly siphoning resources from the estate itself, perhaps preparing for a future where such resources might prove necessary, whether through inheritance, through some engineered removal of Nathaniel's authority, or through means darker still that Nathaniel did not yet wish to consider fully. I want a complete accounting of every payment authorized under my brother's signature for the past year, Nathaniel said. Quietly, Faulkner. I do not want him aware that we are looking until I have gathered enough to act decisively. It will take time, Your Grace. Some records are held with the estate's bankers in London, and I will need a reason to request them that does not raise suspicion. Take whatever time is necessary, but move as quickly as discretion allows. I fear we may not have the luxury of patience for much longer. Faulkner departed with the ledger tucked carefully beneath his arm, and Nathaniel spent the remainder of that gray morning turning the full shape of the danger over in his mind. Margaret's accusation, troubling as it was, now felt almost like a smaller piece of a far larger design, a convenient distraction perhaps, meant to occupy Nathaniel's attention and cast doubt on his judgment, while his brother continued whatever quiet work he had already set in motion beneath the surface of ordinary estate business. When Lily arrived for her usual visit that afternoon, Nathaniel found it harder than usual to mask the weight pressing down on him, though the girl, as always, seemed to sense more than her age should have allowed. "You look tired," she said, settling onto her stool with her customary bluntness. "Did you not sleep?" "Not much," Nathaniel admitted. "There is a great deal on my mind at present." "Is it about my mother?" Lily asked, her small face suddenly serious in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of how much a child could absorb from the anxious atmosphere of the adults around her, even when no one spoke openly of danger in her presence. "Partly," Nathaniel said carefully, unwilling to burden her further with truths she was too young to carry, yet unwilling also to insult her intelligence with an outright denial. "But I promise you, I am working very hard to make certain nothing bad happens to her, or to you." Lily studied him for a long moment with the searching honesty only children seem to possess, then nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with an answer that offered reassurance without pretending the danger did not exist at all. "My mother says you are the kindest man she has ever known," she said, kinder than she expected a duke to be. The words settled somewhere warm in Nathaniel's chest, cutting through some of the cold determination that had gripped him since the previous night's discovery. Whatever his brother's ambitions, whatever schemes still lay hidden beneath careful signatures and quiet payments, Nathaniel found his resolve strengthened rather than weakened by the simple trust of a child who believed, without any doubt at all, that he would keep his promise to protect the people she loved most. He intended to prove her right, whatever the cost to himself, and whatever lengths his brother's ambition still had left to reach. 3 weeks after the accusation against Margaret first surfaced, Faulkner returned to Ashworth Hall with a leather case full of documents and an expression that told Nathaniel, before a single word was spoken, that whatever he had uncovered was worse than either of them had anticipated. "Your Grace," Faulkner said, closing the study door firmly behind him, "I believe I have found what we were looking for, and considerably more besides." He spread the documents across the desk methodically, explaining each one in turn. Over the past 8 months, Julian had authorized payments totaling nearly £4,000 to a private account held under a false trading name, funds drawn steadily from the estate's reserves under the guise of infrastructure repairs and tenant improvements that, upon closer inspection, had never actually been carried out. The tenant farms Julian claimed to have improved showed no record of new construction. The roads he claimed to have repaired remained exactly as worn and untended as they had been the previous year. "He has been preparing something, Your Grace," Faulkner said grimly. "Whether he intends to use these funds to establish himself independently, or whether he harbors larger ambitions regarding the estate itself, I cannot say with certainty. But the pattern is unmistakable. He has been quietly draining resources for himself, and doing so under cover of legitimate authority you yourself granted him after your accident." Nathaniel sat with the weight of the revelation pressing heavily against his chest. He had trusted Julian with greater responsibility over the estate's daily affairs precisely because his own condition had made certain tasks more difficult to manage personally, never once suspecting his brother would use that trust as cover for outright theft. "There is one more matter, Your Grace," Faulkner added, more carefully now. "I made discreet inquiries regarding the footman, Grayson, whom Mrs. Ellis mentioned. His wages have been supplemented significantly beyond his usual position's pay, drawn from the same account structure used for Lord Julian's other irregular payments. I believe we have found the connection between the theft accusation against Mrs. Ellis and your brother's broader activities." It was exactly the proof Nathaniel had hoped to find, evidence linking Julian directly to the manufactured accusation against Margaret, evidence that could clear her name entirely while simultaneously exposing the far larger deception his brother had been carrying out beneath the surface of ordinary household business. "I want this compiled formally," Nathaniel said, in language a magistrate would find impossible to dismiss. "And I want it done quietly, Faulkner. until we are ready to present it. May I ask what you intend to do with it, Your Grace? Nathaniel considered the question seriously before answering. I intend to confront him directly first. He deserves the chance to explain himself, however unlikely I find it that any explanation will satisfy me. But if he refuses to account honestly for what he has done, I will not hesitate to see the full weight of the law brought against him, brother or not. That evening, Nathaniel summoned Julian to his study, choosing to conduct the confrontation privately rather than in front of the household staff, both out of a lingering hope that some explanation might yet emerge, and out of a desire to control precisely how and when the truth became public knowledge, should it come to that. Julian arrived with his usual easy confidence, though something in his expression shifted subtly the moment he saw the document spread across Nathaniel's desk. "You wish to see me, brother?" he asked, his voice carrying only the faintest edge of caution beneath its practiced calm. "Sit down, Julian," Nathaniel said. "We have a great deal to discuss." Julian took the offered seat slowly, his eyes drifting repeatedly toward the papers on the desk, though he made no move to reach for them or ask directly what they contained. "You look troubled," he said. "Has something happened?" "I know about the payments," Nathaniel said simply, deciding there was little value in prolonging the confrontation with careful, circling questions his brother would only use to buy time. Nearly £4,000 drawn from the estate's reserves over the past 8 months, directed toward a private account under a false name. "I know about the tenant improvements that were never made, and the road repairs that never happened, and I know about Grayson's supplemented wages, drawn from that same account, coinciding precisely with the theft accusation against Mrs. Ellis." For a long moment Julian said nothing at all, his expression cycling rapidly through several possible responses, before settling into something colder and more resigned than Nathaniel had ever seen from his brother before. "So you found it," Julian said finally, his voice flat. "I confess, I did not expect you to look so closely. You have shown little interest in the estate's finer details since your accident." "Do not attempt to make this about my condition," Nathaniel said sharply. "This is about theft, Julian. Theft from our own family, and a manufactured accusation designed to destroy an innocent woman's reputation and livelihood, simply because her daughter's friendship with me threatened whatever plans you had already set in motion." "Threatened is a strong word," Julian said, though the denial carried little conviction. "I merely believed the arrangement unwise. A duke's household should not revolve around the whims of a servant's child, however charming she might be." "You manufactured a theft accusation, Julian. You had a footman lie about seeing Margaret near a cabinet she had no reason to enter, using a key only you possessed. That is not a matter of unwise arrangements. That is a deliberate attempt to ruin an innocent woman's life." Julian's composure finally cracked, frustration bleeding through the careful mask he had maintained since entering the room. "What did you expect me to do, Nathaniel? Watch quietly while you handed our family's legacy over to sentiment for a maid and her daughter? You have not managed this estate properly since the accident. Everyone knows it, even if none dare say it to your face. I was simply preparing for what was likely to come regardless of whether either of us wished it." "Preparing," Nathaniel repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "By stealing from the very estate you claim to be protecting." "Borrowing," Julian corrected, though even he seemed to recognize how weak the distinction sounded once spoken aloud. "I always intended to see it returned, once matters were settled properly." "Once you had claimed the dukedom for yourself, you mean," Nathaniel said. "Once you had found some way to see me declared unfit, whether through manufactured scandal, manufactured incompetence, or whatever other scheme you had waiting beneath the surface of this one." Julian did not deny it, and the silence that followed confirmed everything Nathaniel had feared since first discovering the irregular payments buried within the estate's ledgers. His own brother had been quietly working toward his removal for months, perhaps longer, using every available tool from careful rumor to outright theft, all while maintaining a careful appearance of concerned family loyalty in front of the household staff and anyone else who might have noticed his growing ambitions. "I want the money returned in full," Nathaniel said finally. "Every pound, drawn back from wherever you have hidden it, restored to the estate's reserves before the month is out. And I want you to instruct Grayson to provide a full, honest account of the false accusation against Mrs. Ellis, clearing her name entirely and publicly, before the household staff who have spent weeks whispering against her." "And if I refuse?" Julian asked, though the defiance in his voice sounded thinner than he likely intended. "Then I will present everything Faulkner has gathered to the local magistrate, and you will answer for theft from a noble estate, a crime that carries considerably harsher consequences than you seem to appreciate." I will not protect you from the law simply because we share a family name, Julian. Not after what you have done to an innocent woman who never once wronged you. Julian studied him for a long moment, searching perhaps for some sign of bluff or hesitation, and finding none. Whatever calculations passed behind his eyes in that silence, he ultimately gave a stiff, reluctant nod. I will see it returned, he said, and I will speak to Grayson. See that you do, Nathaniel said, quickly and completely. My patience for further delay has entirely run out. Julian left the study without another word, his usual easy confidence replaced by something tighter and more brittle, and Nathaniel sat alone afterward with a complicated mixture of relief and continued unease settling over him. The immediate danger to Margaret's position seemed likely to pass, but he understood, with a clarity that had grown sharper over the preceding weeks, that his brother's ambition would not simply vanish because one scheme had been exposed and dismantled. Julian had shown himself willing to manufacture accusations, drain estate resources, and manipulate loyal staff members in pursuit of what he believed he was owed. Such willingness did not disappear overnight simply because a single confrontation had forced a temporary retreat. 2 days later, true to his word, Julian instructed Grayson to recant his testimony before Mrs. Whitfield and several members of the household staff, admitting under careful questioning that he had never actually witnessed Margaret near the family wing's private cabinet, and that his earlier statement had been made at Lord Julian's specific request, in exchange for supplemented wages he had been too tempted to refuse. The confession spread quickly through the household, and within days, the whispers that had once painted Margaret as a scheming opportunist shifted instead toward quiet admiration for a woman who had endured false accusation with such steady dignity. Nathaniel watched the transformation with cautious satisfaction, though he remained acutely aware that the larger battle, the question of who truly controlled Ashworth's future, had not yet reached its conclusion. His brother's financial deception had been exposed, but not yet fully accounted for, and Nathaniel suspected, correctly as it would soon prove, that Julian was not a man who accepted defeat easily, especially not defeat delivered by a brother he had long considered too weakened by circumstance to pose any real threat at all. Margaret came to his study that same evening, once word of Grayson's confession had reached her fully. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before entering, her expression carrying a mixture of relief and lingering disbelief, as though she still expected some further complication to arrive and undo the good news before she allowed herself to trust it fully. They tell me my name has been cleared, she said quietly. That Grayson admitted to lying. He did, Nathaniel confirmed, and everyone in this household now knows the accusation against you was false from the start. Margaret sank into the chair across from his desk, the tension she had carried for weeks finally beginning to loosen from her shoulders. I did not think it possible, she admitted. I had already begun preparing myself to leave, Your Grace. I had written to a cousin in the north, asking whether she might have room for us should I lose my position here. The admission struck Nathaniel harder than he expected, a reminder of exactly how close the household's cruelty had come to driving away the one friendship that had done more to restore his sense of purpose than anything in the 3 years since his accident. I am glad it did not come to that, he said. You and Lily belong here, if you wish to remain. We do wish it, Margaret said, and for the first time since he had known her, something like genuine warmth colored her voice rather than careful, guarded politeness. Lily would not forgive either of us if we left now. She has grown quite attached to your afternoons together. As have I, Nathaniel admitted freely. Margaret studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. May I ask you something, Your Grace? Honestly, without offense taken either way? Of course. Do you believe your brother's scheming has truly ended, or only paused, waiting for a better opportunity? Nathaniel considered the question carefully, unwilling to offer false reassurance, simply to ease her worry. I do not believe it has ended, he admitted. Julian has shown himself willing to go further than I ever expected, and I do not believe a single confrontation, however direct, will be enough to change the nature of his ambition. I intend to remain watchful, Margaret, for your sake, and for the estate's. Margaret nodded slowly, accepting the honest answer with the same steady composure she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. Thank you for not pretending the danger has passed entirely, she said. I have had enough of comforting lies to last a lifetime. You will have no lies from me, Nathaniel said, comforting or otherwise. In the days that followed, Nathaniel turned his attention more fully toward securing the estate against any further attempts his brother might make. He instructed Faulkner to formally document the returned funds, ensuring a clear paper trail existed should the matter ever need to be presented before a magistrate in the future. He also began, quietly and carefully, reviewing the terms of his own authority over the estate, consulting with Faulkner about what legal protections might exist to prevent Julian from ever again gaining the kind of unsupervised access to household accounts that had allowed his scheme to flourish undetected for so many months. Lily's visits continued through this period, offering Nathaniel a welcome reprieve from the tense, careful calculations that otherwise consumed his days. She seemed entirely unaware of the deeper danger that had briefly threatened her mother's position, content instead to fill their afternoons with stories of the garden's changing seasons and increasingly elaborate drawings that now covered nearly every surface of his study. "You seem happier," she observed one afternoon, studying him with the same searching honesty she always brought to their conversations. "Not as tired as before." "I am happier," Nathaniel admitted, "though there is still work to be done before I can rest easily." "What kind of work?" Nathaniel considered how much truth a child her age could reasonably absorb, then settled on an answer honest enough to satisfy her curiosity, without burdening her with the full weight of adult schemes she was still too young to fully understand. "Making certain this house stays a safe place for you and your mother," he said, "for a long time to come." Lily seemed satisfied with this answer, returning her attention to the drawing in her lap, and Nathaniel watched her work in comfortable silence, grateful for the small, steady presence that had done more to anchor him through recent weeks than any solicitor's careful documentation or any confrontation with his brother ever could. Whatever battles still lay ahead, he found himself facing them now with a resolve he had not possessed in the lonely years since his accident, a resolve born not from duty or pride, but from the simple, fierce desire to protect the two people who had given him back a reason to want more from his life than mere survival within its quiet, empty rooms. The summons arrived on a cold morning in early spring, delivered by a messenger in formal livery Nathaniel did not immediately recognize, and its contents struck him with a force he had not anticipated even after weeks of watching his brother with careful suspicion. Julian had petitioned the county court to declare Nathaniel unfit to manage the Ashworth estate. The document, drafted with careful legal precision, cited his physical condition as evidence of diminished capacity, questioned his judgment regarding household staff, and referenced, in language dressed up as concern rather than accusation, his growing and unusual attachment to a servant's child, as proof of instability unbecoming a man responsible for a noble estate's affairs. A hearing had been scheduled within the fortnight before a visiting magistrate and a panel of the estate's senior solicitors, where evidence would be presented, and a formal ruling made regarding Nathaniel's continued authority over Ashworth Hall and all its holdings. Nathaniel read the document twice, disbelief giving way slowly to a cold, focused anger unlike anything he had felt during the earlier confrontation over the missing funds. He had believed, foolishly perhaps, that exposing his brother's theft and forcing the return of stolen money had settled the matter decisively. Instead, Julian had simply retreated to regroup, waiting for an opportunity to strike with something far more dangerous than a manufactured accusation against a housemaid. "He means to take everything," Nathaniel said aloud, though only Faulkner sat across from him in the study, having arrived within the hour of the summons reaching Ashworth Hall. "It appears so, Your Grace," Faulkner said grimly, studying the petition with obvious concern. "This is a serious matter. If the magistrate rules in Lord Julian's favor, you could lose formal control over the estate entirely, regardless of your title. Guardianship could be transferred to him as the next capable heir. Can he truly build a case on nothing more than my condition and a friendship with a child? He will attempt to build it on considerably more than that, I suspect," Faulkner said. "Petitions of this nature typically require a pattern of evidence, not a single incident. I imagine he has spent recent weeks gathering testimony from staff members sympathetic to his position, framing every unconventional decision you have made since your accident as further proof of instability." Nathaniel felt the full weight of the danger settle over him. This was no longer a matter of protecting Margaret's position within the household, or even recovering stolen funds. This was a direct attempt to strip him of everything: his title's authority, his home, and quite possibly his ability to protect the very people he had fought so hard to defend over recent weeks. "We have 2 weeks to prepare," Faulkner said. "It will not be enough time to gather everything I would prefer, but it may be sufficient if we focus carefully on what will matter most before the magistrate." "Then let us begin immediately," Nathaniel said. The following days passed in a blur of careful preparation, Faulkner working tirelessly to compile evidence of Julian's financial misconduct into a form suitable for formal legal presentation, while Nathaniel himself reviewed every decision he had made regarding the estate since his accident, searching for any weakness his brother's petition might exploit before the magistrate. Mrs. Whitfield proved unexpectedly valuable during this period, offering detailed testimony regarding the household's daily operations under Nathaniel's continued oversight, evidence that directly contradicted any claim that he had grown incapable of managing his responsibilities. She also revealed, with visible reluctance, that Julian had approached her privately in recent days, attempting to secure her testimony in support of his petition, an offer she had firmly declined once she understood its full implications. "He offered me a position of greater authority, Your Grace," she admitted, should his petition succeed and he assume control of the estate. "I told him plainly that I would not lie for any man, however generous his promises, and that my loyalty remained with you, as it always has." Nathaniel thanked her sincerely, though the revelation only deepened his understanding of exactly how far his brother was willing to go, offering bribes and false promises to anyone who might strengthen his case before the court. Margaret, too, faced her own difficult choice during this period. Faulkner had determined that her testimony, describing the manufactured theft accusation and Julian's clear involvement in its construction, would prove valuable evidence of his brother's willingness to deceive and manipulate in pursuit of his ambitions. But testifying publicly meant exposing herself once more to scrutiny, and risking whatever fragile peace had returned to her position within the household since Grayson's confession had cleared her name. "I will testify," Margaret said, when Nathaniel raised the possibility carefully, unwilling to pressure her into a decision that carried real risk to her own security. "I have hidden from enough danger already, Your Grace. I would rather face it directly than wonder afterward whether my silence allowed injustice to prevail." Her courage steadied Nathaniel's own resolve considerably in the days that followed, though the greatest uncertainty of all remained the question of Lily, and whether the magistrate would view her friendship with Nathaniel as evidence of genuine kindness, or twist it, as Julian's petition suggested, into proof of some inappropriate weakness unbecoming a duke's judgment. The day of the hearing arrived beneath a sky heavy with gray clouds, matching the tense atmosphere that had settled over Ashworth Hall in the weeks since the summons first arrived. The great hall, so recently empty on Nathaniel's forgotten birthday, now filled with a very different kind of gathering: solicitors, household staff called to testify, and Julian himself, seated with careful composure beside his own legal representation, his expression betraying none of the ambition that had driven him to this moment. The magistrate, a stern man named Mr. Coleman with decades of experience presiding over county disputes, opened the proceedings with a formal reading of Julian's petition, outlining the claims of diminished capacity and questionable judgment in careful, measured language that nonetheless carried an undeniable weight given the seriousness of what was being decided. Julian's solicitor spoke first, presenting a case built carefully around Nathaniel's physical limitations, questioning whether a man confined to a wheeled chair could reasonably manage an estate's full range of responsibilities, and suggesting, with careful phrasing designed to avoid outright cruelty while still implying its substance, that his growing attachment to a servant's young daughter reflected a mind perhaps softened by isolation and loneliness beyond what sound judgment could withstand. Nathaniel listened with tightly controlled patience, understanding that any visible anger during this portion of the proceedings would only lend credibility to the very claims being made against him. When his turn came to respond, he spoke calmly and directly, addressing the magistrate without the practiced flourishes his brother's solicitor had employed, relying instead on plain, honest explanation of his continued involvement in every significant estate decision made since his accident. "My condition affects my legs, Mr. Coleman," Nathaniel said. "It has never affected my mind, my judgment, or my capacity to fulfill my responsibilities to this estate and the people who depend upon it. I would ask the court to examine the actual record of my stewardship these past 3 years, rather than assumptions built upon my physical circumstances alone." Faulkner then presented the financial evidence gathered over recent weeks, laying out in careful detail the irregular payments authorized under Julian's signature, the false accounts, the fabricated tenant improvements that had never actually occurred, and the direct connection between those funds and the supplemented wages paid to Grayson in exchange for false testimony against an innocent housemaid. The revelation sent a visible ripple through the gathered assembly, and Nathaniel watched his brother's careful composure begin to crack under the weight of evidence he had clearly not expected to be presented so thoroughly or so publicly. "This is a separate matter entirely," Julian's solicitor protested, though his objection carried less confidence than it had at the proceeding's outset. "The petition concerns His Grace's fitness to manage the estate, not any unrelated financial irregularities." "On the contrary," Mr. Coleman said, his tone sharpening with evident interest, "a pattern of deception designed to manipulate household affairs and manufacture false accusations against an innocent servant speaks directly to the character and reliability of the petition's own author. I will hear this evidence in full." Margaret testified next, her voice steady despite the visible nervousness that had gripped her since arriving at the hall that morning, describing in careful detail the false accusation that had nearly cost her both her position and her reputation, and the subsequent confession that had revealed Julian's direct involvement in its construction. Mrs. Whitfield followed, confirming the account and revealing Julian's failed attempt to secure her false testimony through the promise of advancement, evidence that struck a particularly damaging blow to the credibility of his entire petition. By the time the proceedings turned to the question of Lily's friendship with Nathaniel, the atmosphere in the hall had shifted considerably from where it had begun, the earlier suggestions of instability now carrying far less weight against the backdrop of Julian's exposed deception. Nathaniel spoke plainly on this matter as well, refusing to treat the friendship as something requiring defense or apology. A child's kindness reminded me that my life still held value, even after circumstances had taken so much from me, he said. I see nothing in that friendship deserving of scrutiny, Mr. Coleman, beyond perhaps envy, from those who have forgotten what simple decency looks like. Mr. Coleman studied him for a long moment, before finally turning his attention fully toward Julian, whose earlier composure had entirely dissolved under the accumulated weight of testimony and evidence presented against him. Lord Julian, the magistrate said, you have presented this court with a petition, questioning your brother's fitness to manage his own estate, while simultaneously standing accused, through credible testimony and documented evidence, of theft, deception, and the manufacture of false accusations against a member of his household. I find your petition entirely without merit, and I find your own conduct considerably more deserving of this court's scrutiny than anything you have alleged against the Duke of Ashworth. The ruling landed with the finality of a door closing, and Nathaniel felt the tension that had gripped his chest for weeks finally begin to loosen, replaced by something that felt almost unfamiliar in its lightness. Julian sat frozen for a long moment, his face pale, before rising stiffly and departing the hall without a single word to anyone present, his solicitor trailing behind him with an expression of barely concealed embarrassment. Mr. Coleman addressed the remaining assembly with a final note of formal instruction, indicating that the matter of Julian's financial misconduct would be referred separately for further legal consideration, given the seriousness of the theft involved, and that Nathaniel's authority over Ashworth Hall and its holdings remained entirely intact, confirmed rather than diminished by the proceedings that had been intended to strip it away. As the hall slowly emptied, Nathaniel found Margaret waiting near the entrance, her expression carrying a relief so profound it seemed to soften years of careful, guarded caution all at once. It is over, she said, though the words carried the quality of a question, as though she still needed confirmation before allowing herself to believe it fully. It is over, Nathaniel confirmed. You are safe, Margaret, you and Lily both, for good this time. Margaret's composure finally broke, tears gathering in her eyes, though a smile accompanied them, an expression of relief too complete to remain hidden any longer. Thank you, she said simply, the words carrying far more weight than their brevity suggested. For all of it. Nathaniel shook his head slightly. It is Lily who deserves the thanks, he said. She is the one who reminded me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible to win. Outside, the gray clouds that had hung over Ashworth Hall since morning had finally begun to break apart, thin streams of afternoon sunlight breaking through to touch the estate's old stone walls, and Nathaniel wheeled himself toward the entrance to feel it properly for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, the warmth settling over him like the promise of a future he had nearly given up believing he still deserved. Word of the hearing's outcome spread through the household within hours, carried from servant to servant with the same swiftness that had once carried Julian's careful whispers of suspicion against Margaret. This time, however, the news carried no cruelty with it, only a kind of collective relief that seemed to settle over Ashworth Hall as thoroughly as the returning sunlight. Staff members who had once eyed Margaret with wary suspicion now offered quiet nods of respect as she passed through the corridors, and Mrs. Whitfield, in a gesture entirely uncharacteristic of her usually reserved manner, embraced her briefly in the servants' hall, before quickly composing herself and returning to her customary business-like efficiency. Nathaniel spent that evening in quiet consultation with Faulkner, addressing the practical matters that remained following the hearing's conclusion. Julian's access to estate accounts was formally revoked, his keys to the family wing surrendered under Faulkner's careful supervision, and arrangements began for the separate legal proceedings regarding his financial misconduct, proceedings that would, in the weeks ahead, result in Julian's departure from Ashworth Hall entirely, relocated to a modest property in a distant county that Nathaniel arranged more out of lingering family obligation than any genuine desire to see his brother comfortable. Do you regret it? Faulkner asked carefully, once the practical arrangements had been settled. showing him such leniency, given everything he attempted against you? Nathaniel considered the question for a long moment before answering. He is still my brother, whatever damage his ambition caused. I do not forgive what he did, and I will not forget it, but I have no wish to see him destroyed entirely, only removed from any position where his ambition might harm others again. Perhaps that makes me foolish. I find I do not particularly care, so long as Margaret and Lily remain safe. Faulkner nodded, offering no further argument, and departed shortly after, leaving Nathaniel alone with the quiet satisfaction of a battle finally concluded, even if its resolution had not been as absolute or as vengeful as some might have expected from a man wronged so deeply by his own family. Lily arrived the following afternoon for her usual visit, entirely unaware of the formal proceedings that had consumed the household's attention the previous day, though she seemed to sense immediately that something significant had shifted in the atmosphere around her. Everyone seems happier today, she observed, settling onto her stool with a fresh drawing already prepared for him, this one depicting the entire household staff gathered together beneath a bright, carefully colored sun. Mrs. Whitfield even smiled at me in the hallway. She never smiles. Nathaniel laughed, a sound that came more easily now than it had in the months before her small knock had first interrupted his solitary birthday. A great deal of trouble has passed, Lily. I believe everyone is simply relieved it has finally settled. Was it about the bad man? Lily asked, with the directness that had never once failed to surprise him, even after months of her company. Nathaniel hesitated, uncertain how much truth a child her age could reasonably absorb regarding her uncle's schemes, before settling on an answer honest enough to satisfy her curiosity without burdening her further. There was someone who wanted to cause trouble for this house, he said carefully, but that trouble has passed now, and I do not believe it will return. Lily seemed satisfied with this explanation, returning her attention to arranging her chalks across his desk with the same careful concentration she brought to every visit. Good, she said simply. I did not like seeing you and Mother worried all the time. It is much nicer when everyone is happy. Yes, Nathaniel agreed, watching her work with a warmth that had become as familiar to him now as the ache in his legs once had been in the earliest days after his accident. It is much nicer indeed. That evening, once Lily had returned to her mother's care and the household had settled into its usual quiet rhythm, Nathaniel wheeled himself out onto the small stone terrace adjoining his study, a space he had rarely used since his accident, when the effort of navigating its uneven threshold had seemed too great a burden to justify the trouble. Tonight, however, he found the effort entirely worthwhile, the evening air carrying the fresh, clean scent of rain-washed earth, the stars beginning to emerge overhead in a sky finally free of the heavy gray clouds that had pressed down upon the estate for so many recent weeks. He thought of his birthday months earlier, the empty hall, the untouched cake, the crushing solitude that had seemed, at the time, like a permanent condition he would simply have to endure for whatever years remained to him. He thought of Lily's small knock at his door, her crooked drawing, her fearless questions that had refused to treat his condition as anything shameful or diminishing. He thought of Margaret's quiet strength through weeks of danger she had never sought and never deserved, and of the courage she had shown in testifying before the magistrate despite every reason her past experience had given her to remain silent and hidden instead. Whatever battles still lay ahead, whatever adjustments the estate would require in the wake of Julian's departure, Nathaniel found himself facing the future with a steadiness he had not known since before the accident that had once seemed to end his usefulness entirely. He was still a man confined to a wheeled chair, still dependent on others for tasks his body no longer allowed him to manage alone. But he was no longer a man forgotten, and as he watched the stars multiply overhead in the clearing spring sky, he understood, with a certainty that settled warm and steady in his chest, that whatever birthday came next would look nothing like the lonely, empty evening that had once seemed destined to define the remainder of his life. A full year had passed since Nathaniel Hale sat alone in a hall built for 100 guests, and as his 43rd birthday approached, he found himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to remember, actually looking forward to the day rather than dreading its arrival. Much had changed at Ashworth Hall in the months since Julian's departure. Nathaniel had taken a far more active role in the estate's daily management, working closely with Faulkner to establish clearer oversight of every account and expenditure, ensuring no single person, however trusted, could again gain the kind of unsupervised access that had allowed his brother's scheme to flourish, undetected for so many months. He had also, gradually and with growing confidence, begun receiving visitors again, neighboring families who had once avoided Ashworth Hall out of awkward discomfort now finding genuine warmth in a duke who no longer carried himself like a man ashamed of his own condition. The change had not happened all at once. In the weeks following the hearing, Nathaniel had noticed a quiet shift in how the local gentry regarded him, whispers of the scandal involving his brother's attempted deception traveling through the county's social circles alongside admiration for the steady, dignified manner in which Nathaniel had defended both his estate and his household staff against such a serious threat. Invitations that had once dried up entirely began arriving again, tentative at first, then with growing regularity, as neighboring families rediscovered a duke whose company they had too easily dismissed following his accident. Nathaniel accepted some of these invitations, though he remained selective, no longer willing to spend his limited energy on relationships that offered only shallow, obligatory courtesy. The friendships he cultivated in the months that followed were fewer in number, but far more genuine in substance, built on actual regard rather than social obligation. A distinction he had learned to value deeply after watching so many supposed friends abandon him so easily during his darkest years. Margaret's position within the household had transformed as well, though the change came gradually, and with careful consideration for how it might appear to those still inclined toward gossip. Nathaniel had, in the months following the hearing, promoted her to a position overseeing the household's linen and provisions accounts, work that suited her careful, meticulous nature, far better than the physically demanding duties of a housemaid. And that came with a considerably improved wage, allowing her far greater security than she had known since her husband's death. Lily, now 7 years old, had grown into a confident, curious child whose afternoons in Nathaniel's study had become such an established fixture of the household's routine that even the most cautious staff members no longer thought to comment on it. She had begun, at Nathaniel's quiet insistence and expense, receiving proper lessons from a tutor engaged for the household's younger residents, her natural intelligence flourishing under attention and opportunity her mother's modest wages could never have provided alone. As his birthday approached that spring, Nathaniel found himself, almost involuntarily, recalling the previous year's empty hall, the untouched cake, the crushing loneliness that had seemed at the time like a permanent fixture of his remaining years. He mentioned it once to Edwin, while being helped into his evening clothes for what he expected would be another quiet dinner, perhaps with Faulkner and a handful of genuine friends who had proven their loyalty in recent months. "Do you remember last year's birthday, Edwin?" he asked. "How empty this house felt." "I remember, Your Grace," Edwin said. "I do not believe this year will feel quite the same." Nathaniel did not fully understand the meaning behind Edwin's careful smile until he wheeled himself toward the grand hall that evening, expecting the modest, quiet gathering he had anticipated, and found instead a room transformed entirely from the empty, candlelit solitude of the previous year. The hall was full. Neighboring families who had rediscovered their regard for him over recent months filled the long tables, their conversation warm and genuine, rather than the stiff, obligatory courtesy of years past. Household staff, given leave to join the celebration in a departure from strict tradition Nathaniel himself had quietly authorized, gathered near the hall's edges, Mrs. Whitfield among them wearing an expression of genuine pleasure, rather than her usual careful composure. Faulkner stood near the head table, raising an early toast in Nathaniel's direction the moment their eyes met across the crowded room. And near the center of it all, practically vibrating with excitement she could barely contain, stood Lily, dressed in a new frock Margaret had clearly spent considerable care preparing for the occasion, a fresh drawing clutched in her hands just as it had been exactly 1 year earlier. "Happy birthday," Lily said, rushing forward the moment she spotted him, entirely unconcerned with the formal atmosphere surrounding her small, delighted announcement. This year, everyone came. Nathaniel took the offered drawing with hands that trembled slightly, more from emotion than from any lingering effect of his condition, and studied the image she had prepared. It showed the same crooked house from the year before, but now filled with dozens of small figures instead of just a handful, every window drawn with careful, deliberate attention. And above the house, in handwriting considerably neater than the previous year's effort, the words "Happy Birthday, Duke," followed by a smaller addition that had clearly been Lily's own idea entirely. "My friend, this is remarkable," Nathaniel said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no attempt to hide from the gathered guests surrounding him. "Thank you, Lily, for this, and for so very much more than you likely realize." Margaret approached shortly after, her own expression carrying a warmth and confidence considerably different from the cautious, guarded woman who had first appeared in his study doorway a year earlier, chasing after a daughter who had wandered somewhere she was not supposed to go. "She has been planning this drawing for weeks, Your Grace," Margaret said. "She wanted this year's birthday to look nothing like the last one." "She succeeded admirably," Nathaniel said, glancing around the full, warm hall with a gratitude too deep for easy words to fully capture. "As did you, Margaret. This house would look nothing like it does today without your courage these past months." Margaret's cheeks colored slightly at the praise, though she accepted it with far more ease than she once would have. "We are simply glad to see you happy, Your Grace. Truly happy, not merely managing through another difficult year." As the evening progressed, Nathaniel found himself moving through the crowded hall with an ease he had not expected, his wheeled chair no longer feeling like the barrier it once had, but simply another feature of a man his guests had come to know and genuinely respect, condition and all. Conversations flowed easily, laughter filled corners of the hall that had stood cold and silent the previous year, and when the time came for the customary toast, Nathaniel found himself raising his glass not to his title, nor to the estate's continued prosperity, but to something considerably more personal. "A year ago," he said, his voice carrying easily across the now quiet hall, "I sat in this very room entirely alone, believing my usefulness, my place among all of you, had ended the day my legs stopped answering me. I want to offer tonight's toast to the person who proved me wrong, who reminded me that worth is not measured by what a man can no longer do, but by what remains true in his heart regardless of circumstance." He looked toward Lily, standing beside her mother near the edge of the gathered crowd, her face bright with unguarded delight at finding herself suddenly the center of so much attention. "To Lily, whose small kindness on a lonely evening changed the entire course of my life, and to Margaret, whose courage and steadiness taught me what genuine strength truly looks like. This house is full tonight because of you both, and I intend to see that it never stands empty again." The hall erupted into warm applause, and Nathaniel watched Lily's face flush with a mixture of pride and bashful embarrassment at the public attention, while Margaret's eyes glistened with tears she made no particular effort to hide from the gathered assembly. Later that evening, once most of the guests had departed and only Faulkner, Mrs. Whitfield, and a handful of close friends remained, Nathaniel called Margaret aside for a private conversation, drawing her toward the same quiet corner of the study where their difficult conversation about Lily's continued visits had taken place nearly a year earlier. "I have been considering something," he said carefully, "and I wanted to discuss it with you directly, rather than through any formal channel that might feel impersonal given everything we have weathered together this past year." "Of course, Your Grace," Margaret said, though something in her expression suggested a growing curiosity about what he intended to propose. "I would like to establish a formal provision for both you and Lily," Nathaniel said. "Not merely continued employment, but genuine security, regardless of whatever changes the future might bring to this household. A guarantee of housing, of Lily's continued education, and of your own position, protected legally in a manner that cannot be undone by whatever circumstances arise in years ahead." Margaret's composure faltered slightly, genuine surprise breaking through her usual careful reserve. "Your Grace, that is remarkably generous. I do not know how to properly thank you for such consideration." "You need not thank me," Nathaniel said gently. "You and Lily have given this house, and this lonely man within it, considerably more than any provision I could offer in return. I only wish to ensure that whatever kindness your daughter showed me on that first evening is repaid properly, for as long as I am able to see it done." Margaret's eyes filled with tears once more, though this time they carried none of the fear or exhaustion that had marked so many of their earlier conversations, only genuine gratitude and something that looked, to Nathaniel's careful observation, remarkably like the beginning of a deeper trust than mere employer and servant typically shared. Outside the study window, the spring evening had settled into full darkness, stars scattered across a clear sky entirely unlike the rain that had poured down on his lonely birthday exactly 1 year before. Somewhere in the hall beyond, Lily's laughter carried faintly through the quiet corridors as she played some final game with the departing guests' children before her own bedtime arrived, and Nathaniel sat listening to that sound with a contentment he had genuinely believed, in his darkest years following the accident, he would never again have reason to feel. The hall that had once stood empty on his birthday now stood full of genuine warmth, built not from obligation or pity, but from real connection, earned through honesty, courage, and the simple, fearless kindness of a child who had refused to see anything shameful in a duke who could no longer walk, only a man who deserved, like anyone else, not to spend his birthday entirely alone. In the weeks that followed the celebration, Nathaniel set about making good on his promise to Margaret, with the same careful determination he had once applied to uncovering his brother's deception. He instructed Faulkner to draft a formal deed establishing a permanent residence for Margaret and Lily within the estate's grounds, a modest but comfortable cottage near the eastern gardens that had stood vacant since the death of an old gamekeeper years before, along with a trust fund set aside specifically for Lily's continued education, one that would carry her through whatever schooling her evident intelligence might eventually merit, university included, should she wish to pursue it when she came of age. Margaret protested the scale of the provision at first, insisting it was far more than any household staff member had ever received, and worrying aloud that such generosity might reignite exactly the kind of gossip that had once nearly cost her everything. Nathaniel understood her caution, having learned firsthand how quickly rumor could spread through a household eager for scandal, but he found himself unwilling to let fear of gossip dictate a decision he believed, with complete certainty, to be the right one. "Let them talk, if they wish," he told her, during the conversation where the final papers were signed. "I have learned this past year that the opinions of those quick to judge rarely survive contact with simple, demonstrated truth. Anyone who takes the time to understand why I have made this decision will find nothing scandalous in it at all, only gratitude properly expressed." The cottage renovations began that same week, and Nathaniel found himself, in the months that followed, visiting the site regularly to check on its progress, a habit that puzzled Edwin slightly until he came to understand it was less about the building itself and more about Nathaniel's evident eagerness to see Margaret and Lily settled somewhere that belonged entirely to them, free from any lingering uncertainty about their place within the household's larger structure. Lily, for her part, approached the entire process with characteristic enthusiasm, insisting on choosing the color for her own bedroom walls, and spending several afternoons in Nathaniel's study sketching increasingly elaborate plans for a small garden she intended to plant just outside her window. Nathaniel indulged every request with genuine pleasure, finding in these small, ordinary conversations a contentment that had eluded him for years even before his accident, when his life had been filled with grand social obligations that offered considerably less genuine satisfaction than watching a 7-year-old debate the relative merits of roses versus daisies for her garden's border. News of Julian's circumstances reached Ashworth Hall only occasionally in the months following his departure, carried through brief, formal correspondence from the solicitor overseeing his relocated affairs. The separate legal proceedings regarding his theft from the estate concluded with a settlement requiring full restitution and a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, though Nathaniel had ultimately declined to pursue harsher criminal penalties, choosing instead a resolution that satisfied the law's requirements without further entangling the family name in prolonged scandal. Julian himself never wrote directly, and Nathaniel found he did not particularly miss the correspondence, the silence between them feeling less like unfinished business and more like a chapter of his life he had no wish to reopen unnecessarily. As summer arrived and the cottage neared completion, Nathaniel began noticing subtle changes in how the broader county regarded Ashworth Hall entirely. Where once his estate had been spoken of, in the years following his accident, with a kind of pitying caution, whispered about as the unfortunate household of a broken duke, it now carried a different reputation entirely, one built around the story of a nobleman who had faced betrayal from his own family and emerged not diminished, but strengthened, his household staff fiercely loyal, his judgment increasingly sought after by neighboring families navigating their own difficult circumstances. Lord Pemberton, whose earlier excuse of a prior engagement had kept him from the previous year's forgotten birthday, wrote a lengthy letter that summer requesting Nathaniel's counsel on a dispute involving his own estate's tenants, a request that would have seemed unthinkable a year earlier, when Nathaniel's opinion had carried little weight among a nobility quick to dismiss a man they viewed as diminished by circumstance. Nathaniel responded with characteristic thoughtfulness, offering guidance drawn partly from his own hard-won experience navigating estate management from a wheeled chair, and partly from the careful, methodical approach to fairness he had developed through the long process of protecting Margaret and uncovering his brother's deception. On a warm afternoon in late summer, as the cottage's final touches were completed and Margaret and Lily prepared to move into their new home, Nathaniel found himself once again wheeling toward the small stone terrace adjoining his study, the same spot where he had sat beneath the stars following his birthday celebration months earlier. Lily found him there, as she often did during her afternoon visits, though this time she carried no drawing, only a small bundle of wildflowers she had gathered from the garden near her family's new cottage. "For you," she said simply, presenting the flowers with the same unguarded directness that had first drawn her into his study a year earlier. "Mother says a house should always have flowers in it when something good happens." "And what good thing has happened today?" Nathaniel asked, accepting the small, slightly crumpled bouquet with genuine delight. "We are moving into our new house tomorrow," Lily said, as though the answer were entirely obvious. "Mother says it is because of you. She says you gave us a home." Nathaniel considered the observation carefully before responding, aware that the moment carried more weight than Lily's casual delivery suggested. "You gave me one first," he said finally. "This house felt empty long before your mother ever brought you here to work, Lily. You are the one who filled it again." Lily seemed to accept this explanation with her usual easy grace, climbing onto the low stone bench beside his chair to watch the late afternoon sun settle slowly toward the horizon. The estate's garden spread out beneath them in full summer bloom, roses climbing along the same stone walls that had once framed only silence and rain on a birthday no one had bothered to attend. Nathaniel thought back, as he often did during these quiet moments, to the man he had been a year earlier, sitting alone at a table set for guests who never arrived, certain his usefulness had ended along with his ability to walk. That man had been wrong. He understood now with complete certainty. Wrong not about the difficulty of his circumstances, but about what those circumstances truly meant for the value of the life still ahead of him. A small child's fearless kindness had proven, more thoroughly than any solicitor's careful argument or any magistrate's formal ruling, that worth was never measured by legs that no longer answered, but by a heart still willing to fight for the people who mattered most. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and deep orange above Ashworth Hall's old stone walls, Nathaniel Hale sat beside the small girl whose knock at his door had changed everything, and understood, with a peace he had once believed permanently lost to him, that whatever birthdays remained ahead would never again find him waiting alone in an empty hall. 12 years passed, and the crooked drawings that once covered every surface of Nathaniel Hale's study had long since been replaced by something far more permanent, framed carefully along the walls of a room that had, over the years, transformed from a duke's lonely retreat into the beating heart of a household filled with genuine life. Lily Ellis, now 19 years old, stood in that same study on a bright autumn morning, no longer the small girl who had once climbed onto a low stool to share stories of frogs and clouds, but a young woman of considerable poise and intelligence, dressed for travel, a small trunk already loaded onto the carriage waiting in the courtyard below. "You are certain you have everything?" Nathaniel asked, watching her check through a leather satchel of papers with the same careful concentration she had once brought to arranging her chalks across his desk. "I have checked 3 times already, Your Grace," Lily said, though the formal address carried none of its original distance, having become instead a term of affection between them over the years. A small joke they both understood carried far deeper meaning beneath its surface. "You worry more than my mother does, and that is saying a great deal." Nathaniel smiled, unable to argue the point. The trust he had established for her education all those years ago had carried her further than either of them had initially imagined possible, first through years of careful tutoring at Ashworth Hall itself, and now toward a university in Edinburgh, where she intended to pursue studies in medicine, a path few women of her background had ever been afforded the opportunity to attempt, let alone succeed at pursuing. "I only worry because you matter to me," Nathaniel said simply. "You have always been permitted to remind me when my worrying becomes excessive." "It became excessive around the second time you asked whether I had packed a warm enough coat," Lily said, though her teasing carried unmistakable warmth. "Edinburgh has winters, Your Grace, but I do not believe they will surprise me quite as much as you seem to fear." Margaret entered the study then, dressed for the journey as well, having insisted on accompanying her daughter for the first leg of her travels despite Lily's gentle protests that she was more than capable of managing the trip herself. Margaret's position within the household had grown considerably over the years, her careful management of the estate's provisions eventually expanding into oversight of nearly every aspect of Ashworth Hall's daily operations, a role that had earned her genuine respect throughout the county, entirely separate now from whatever whispered rumors had once threatened to define her. "The carriage is ready whenever you are," Margaret said, though her eyes lingered on her daughter with an expression that mixed pride and reluctance in equal measure. The universal difficulty every parent faces watching a child step forward into a future that no longer requires their constant protection. Lily crossed the study to embrace Nathaniel before departing, an easy familiarity that had developed naturally over the years of shared afternoons, shared meals, and shared difficulties navigated together, as something closer to family than the formal distinctions of Duke and household staff had ever suggested was proper. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you have given me, not just the trust or the tutoring, though I am grateful for both beyond what words can properly express. Thank you for believing a housemaid's daughter could become something more than what the world expected of her." "You believed that long before I did," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying an emotion he made no attempt to hide, even after years of practice at maintaining composure before household staff and visiting nobility alike. "I merely provided the opportunity. Everything you have built from it belongs entirely to you." Lily departed shortly after, her carriage disappearing down the long drive that had once carried only disappointing letters of regret from lords and ladies too indifferent to attend a lonely duke's birthday. Nathaniel watched from the study window until the carriage vanished entirely beyond the tree line, feeling the familiar mixture of pride and quiet loss that had accompanied every milestone of Lily's remarkable journey from anxious housemaid's daughter to confident young woman charting her own future. He thought back, as he often did during such reflective moments, to the many changes the intervening years had brought to Ashworth Hall. His own health had remained stable, his condition unchanged but no longer the defining feature of how the household or the broader county regarded him. He had, in the years since Julian's departure, established himself as a respected voice among the region's landowners. His counsel increasingly sought on matters ranging from tenant fairness to estate management, a reputation built not on the strength of his legs, but on the steady, principled judgment he had cultivated through years of navigating hardship without losing sight of what mattered most. Julian himself had died some 6 years earlier, a brief letter from his solicitor informing Nathaniel of the circumstances, an illness that had progressed quickly in the isolated county where he had lived out his remaining years following his departure from Ashworth. Nathaniel had felt a complicated grief upon receiving the news, mourning not the man his brother had ultimately become, but the boy he remembered from childhood, before ambition and resentment had consumed whatever gentler nature might once have existed beneath the surface. He had arranged for a quiet, private burial, attended by no one beyond the solicitor and a handful of local clergy, a small mercy extended to a man who had shown considerably less mercy to others during his final years of scheming and deception. Mrs. Whitfield had retired from her position 3 years prior, replaced by a younger housekeeper she had personally trained and recommended, though she remained a frequent visitor to Ashworth Hall, particularly fond of the small cottage garden Margaret had cultivated near the eastern grounds, where the two women often spent afternoons together discussing household matters out of habit as much as genuine necessity. Faulkner, too, remained a constant presence in Nathaniel's affairs, his careful diligence having ensured that Ashworth's finances remained secure and transparent in the years since Julian's deception had first been uncovered, a security Nathaniel had come to value beyond mere practical necessity, understanding now how easily trust could be exploited when proper oversight was allowed to lapse. As for Margaret, the years had transformed the cautious, exhausted widow who had once feared for her position over something as innocent as her daughter's friendship into a woman of quiet confidence and evident contentment, her role within Ashworth's household secure beyond any doubt, her relationship with Nathaniel having settled, over the years, into something neither of them had ever formally named, though both understood its depth clearly enough. They shared meals together most evenings, their conversations ranging from estate matters to the small, ordinary pleasures of daily life, a companionship built slowly and carefully from years of trust earned rather than assumed, entirely different from the transactional relationships that had once defined so much of Nathaniel's life among the county's nobility. That evening, following Lily's departure for Edinburgh, Nathaniel found himself once again on the small stone terrace adjoining his study, the same spot where he had once sat beneath the stars following his 43rd birthday celebration, contemplating how thoroughly his life had transformed from the lonely solitude of that first remembered birthday, so many years earlier now. Margaret joined him there, as the evening settled into full darkness, taking her customary seat on the stone bench beside his chair, the same bench where Lily had once presented him with a small bundle of wildflowers on the day her family moved into their new cottage. "She will do wonderfully," Margaret said quietly, understanding, without needing to ask exactly where Nathaniel's thoughts had settled. Whatever nervousness she carries about Edinburgh, she has never once let fear stop her from reaching for what she wants. "She learned that from you," Nathaniel said. "Long before she ever learned it from me." Margaret smiled, accepting the compliment with the same easy grace she had developed over years of genuine partnership rather than careful, guarded deference. Perhaps we both taught her something worthwhile, in our own ways. They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars gathered overhead, the same stars Nathaniel had once watched alone in the months following his brother's failed attempt to strip away everything he valued, believing then that whatever peace he found afterward would remain fragile, temporary, easily shattered by circumstances beyond his control. Instead, that peace had only deepened over the years, built not on the absence of hardship, but on the genuine, hard-won connections he had fought to protect, when it would have been far easier to retreat into isolation and let the world's cruelty go unchallenged. Somewhere beyond the estate's old stone walls, a carriage carried a young woman toward a future that would have seemed entirely impossible for a housemaid's daughter only a generation earlier, a future made possible not by grand gestures or noble birth, but by a single small knock on a lonely duke's door, delivered by a child who had refused to see anything shameful in a man the world had too quickly decided to forget. Nathaniel Hale sat beneath those same familiar stars, no longer the broken, forgotten figure of his darkest birthday, but a man who had learned, through years of quiet struggle and hard-won victory, that a life's true worth was measured not by what circumstance had taken from him, but by what remained steadfast and true within his heart, and by the family, found rather than born, that had gathered around him in the years since a child's fearless kindness first knocked upon his door and refused to let him remain forgotten any longer. Letters arrived from Edinburgh throughout that first autumn, each one filled with Lily's familiar enthusiasm, now directed toward lecture halls and anatomy texts, rather than chalk drawings and garden flowers. She wrote of professors who doubted her place among their students, and of the quiet satisfaction she found in proving each of them wrong through steady, careful work rather than argument. She wrote of the cold Edinburgh winters Nathaniel had worried over so persistently, admitting, in a letter that made him laugh aloud in the privacy of his study, that he had been entirely right to insist on the warmer coat. Nathaniel answered every letter personally, never delegating the task to a secretary despite the estate's many demands on his time, understanding that the correspondence mattered as much to him as it clearly did to her. He wrote of small changes at Ashworth Hall, of Margaret's growing garden, of Faulkner's latest careful improvements to the estate's accounts, small ordinary details that kept Lily connected to the home she had left behind, even as she built a new life for herself many miles away. Years later, when Lily returned to Ashworth Hall as a fully qualified physician, one of remarkably few women to have achieved such standing at the time, she established a small practice serving the estate's tenants and the surrounding villages, refusing more prestigious positions offered to her in London in favor of returning to the community that had first believed in her worth. Nathaniel attended her first official day of practice, seated proudly near the modest clinic's entrance, watching the daughter of a widowed housemaid greet her first patients with the same fearless confidence she had once brought to a lonely duke's study, all those years before. It was, Nathaniel often reflected in his final years, the truest measure of everything that small birthday knock had set in motion, not merely his own restored happiness, though that alone would have been more than he ever expected to reclaim, but the entire trajectory of a young life, given room to flourish, proof enough that kindness offered without calculation or expectation could ripple outward across years and generations, transforming far more than the single lonely evening it had first been offered to ease.